Martha Dawson pressed her hand flat against her chest, right over her heartbeat, and told herself she was not afraid. The letter in her coat pocket had been read so many times the folds had gone soft. Plain-looking preferred. Homely acceptable. Ugly welcome. She had answered it anyway. She had packed one trunk, said goodbye to nobody, and stepped onto a train headed for Abilene, Kansas, in the dead of a July heatwave, because a woman with nothing left to lose has nothing left to fear. If this story already has your heart, subscribe to this channel right now, hit that notification bell, and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that depot platform, because what happened next changed 2 lives forever. The train pulled into Abilene at 2:30 in the afternoon, and the heat came off the platform boards in visible waves. Clem Hadley stood at the edge of that platform with his hat in his hands, turning the brim through his fingers the way a man does when he doesn't know what to do with himself. He was 35 years old. He had 600 acres of Kansas grassland, a herd that needed tending, a house that needed running, and not a single soul to help him do any of it. His first wife Eleanor had died 3 winters back. Fever took her in 4 days, and since then the ranch had been slowly coming apart at the seams. Not dramatically, just quietly. The way things do when there's nobody home to notice them. He had written to the Foss matchmaking agency in February. Mrs. Edna Foss, who ran the agency out of a small office above the dry goods store in Wichita, had a reputation for practical arrangements. Not love matches, practical ones. Clem's letter had been plain as his circumstances. I am not a man of poetry or pretty words. I need a woman who can work, who can cook and manage a household, and who will not wilt in summer heat or panic at the sight of blood. I have been told I am difficult to live with. I will be honest about that. I am also loyal fair, and I do not drink. I ask only for someone sensible. Plain-looking preferred. Homely acceptable. Ugly welcome. Beauty is wasted on a ranch. Mrs. Foss had written back within the week. Mr. Hadley, I believe I have found your match. Her name is Martha Dawson. She is 25 from Hays City, and she answers every one of your stated requirements and several you did not think to ask for. I suggest you trust me on this one. Clem had trusted her. He had sent the train fare and signed the arrangement agreement, and then spent 4 months trying not to think about it too hard. Now the train was stopped, and the platform was filling up with people, and he was standing there, turning his hat to pieces in his hands. A group of women from the Methodist Church were watching him from the end of the platform. He could hear them without trying. That's Clem Hadley, said the one in the yellow bonnet, Clara Birch, the Reverend's wife. Sent off to a matchmaking house, they say. Ordered himself a wife like you'd order a sack of flour. Desperate is what it is, said the one beside her. 3 years since Eleanor, and still can't find a decent woman willing to take that place on. Can't blame the women, Clara said. 600 acres of hard dirt and a man who barely speaks. What kind of life is that? Clem kept his eyes on the train doors. The passengers came off one at a time. A family with 3 small children. 2 traveling salesmen with sample cases. An older gentleman in a black coat. A young cowhand who looked like he'd been sleeping in his clothes for a week. And then Martha Dawson stepped off the train. She came down those steps without hesitating, one hand on the rail and one hand holding her traveling bag, and she planted both feet on the platform, like she'd been expecting it to be exactly where it was. She was a big woman, broad-shouldered, full-figured, carrying weight the way a woman carries it when she's been working since she was 12 years old. Her hair was auburn and thick braided back from her face, and her dress was dark blue cotton. Practical, no unnecessary trim. She was not what anyone would call beautiful by the standards of the ladies' magazines. But the thing that stopped Clem cold was not her size or her face. It was the way she looked at the platform. She didn't look uncertain. She didn't look nervous or apologetic or any of the things a woman in her position might reasonably be expected to look. She looked like she was surveying territory she intended to understand. Her eyes moved across the platform over the church. Women over the waiting men, over the horse posts and the water trough and the freight wagons, and then they found Clem Hadley standing there with his hat in his hands, and they stopped. She walked straight toward him. Behind him, he heard Clara Birch make a sound that wasn't quite a word. Martha stopped 2 feet in front of him and set her bag down on the platform boards. "Mr. Hadley," she said. Her voice was steady and even, not loud, not soft, just sure of itself. "Miss Dawson," he said. "I take it the wagon is yours." "It is." "Good." She picked up her bag again. "I'd like to get out of this heat before the afternoon gets any worse. Is the horse watered?" Clem blinked. "He is." "Then we should go." She turned and walked toward the wagon without looking back. Clem stood there for a half a second longer than he should have. He put his hat back on his head, pulled it level, and followed her. Behind him, Clara Birch said something to the woman beside her. He didn't catch all of it. Just the end, the nerve of her. They didn't speak much on the ride out. 8 miles of open Kansas grassland in July with the sun coming straight down and the dust rising off the road in soft clouds. Clem drove. Martha sat beside him, with her hands folded on her bag, watching the land. After about 2 miles, she said, "How many head been 63, Clem said. 32 cows, 16 calves born this spring, 15 steers. Grazing rotation." He glanced at her sideways. "I move them every 2 weeks. East pasture, then the draw, then north if the grass holds." "Your well, how deep?" 40 feet. "Good water. Hasn't gone dry in 11 years. She nodded like she was filing that away somewhere. He wanted to ask her something. He wasn't sure what. After another mile, he said, "You've been on a ranch before." "My father ran one," she said. "Outside Hays City. 300 acres mixed cattle and hog. I ran the house from when I was 14. "Your father, is he still?" "Dead," she said. 2 years ago. Ranch went to debts." She said it flat. Not like she was asking for sympathy. Just like it was a fact she'd already made her peace with. "I stayed on with a neighbor family after. Helped with their kitchen and their children for a year and a half. Then Mrs. Foss wrote to me." "Edna Foss wrote to you," Clem said. "I thought—" "She keeps a list," Martha said. "Women who've written to her looking for placements. I was on it." She looked at him sideways for the first time. "You asked for ugly." Clem felt his neck go warm. "I asked for practical." "You asked for plain-looking, homely acceptable ugly welcome," she said without any particular heat in it. "I'm not offended. I've been plain my whole life. I know what I look like." She paused. "I also know what I can do. And what I can do is worth more than what I look like. I just need to know you understand that going in." He looked at her. She met his gaze without flinching. "I understand it," he said. She nodded once, and that was that. The ranch house sat at the end of a dirt track off the main road, backed by a stand of cottonwood trees that gave thin shade in the afternoon. The house itself was solidly built. Clem had put it up himself, timber and sod 2 rooms and a lean-to kitchen, but it had the particular disorder of a place where a competent man had been managing everything by himself for too long. Things were in roughly the right place, but nothing was where it ought to be. Martha walked in, set her bag down, and stood in the middle of the main room without speaking for a long moment. Clem stood in the doorway. "I know it needs—" "Where do you keep your flour?" "That cabinet there, top shelf." "Your salt?" "Same cabinet, left side." "How old is that side of bacon?" 3 days, maybe 4. She crossed to the fireplace, crouched down, looked at the ash, stood back up, looked at the shelf above the fireplace where his tins were stacked in no particular order. "You've been eating out of tins," she said, "when I'm busy." "How busy?" "Planting's done. Mending the north fence line this week." She turned around and looked at him directly. "Mr. Hadley, I'm going to reorganize your kitchen. I'm going to take stock of what you have and figure out what you need. I'll cook supper tonight and we can talk about how the house runs while we eat. Does that suit you?" He had not expected to be asked. He had expected he wasn't sure what he'd expected. Something more tentative. "That suits me fine," he said. "Good." She pulled her braid over her shoulder, pushed up her sleeves, and went to work. Clem worked the fence line until the light started going gold, and when he came back to the house, the smell that hit him at the door stopped him where he stood. Real cooking, onions, and something slow and savory. Bread of all things. He hadn't smelled bread in this house in 3 years. He came inside and stood at the kitchen door. Martha was at the stove stirring something in the big iron pot he'd mostly used to boil water for laundry. She had set the table, actually set it plates and cups and a cloth he hadn't known he owned, and the shelves had been rearranged so that he could see at a glance that his flour bin was 2/3 empty and his sugar was almost gone. She looked up when he came in. "Wash up," she said. "It's almost ready." He washed at the basin on the porch, hung his hat, sat down at the table. She brought 2 bowls of beef and vegetable stew and a plate of cornbread and sat down across from him. He picked up his spoon, tasted it. He set the spoon down. "Miss Dawson," he said. She looked up from her own bowl. "This is the best thing I've eaten since—" He stopped. "Since a long time." Something shifted in her face. Not quite a smile, but something close to it. "Thank you," she said. And then, like she didn't want to linger on it. "Now, tell me about the north fence." Word got to town before the week was out. It always did. The first to come by was Hank Briggs, whose property bordered Clem's east pasture. He came with the pretense of returning a borrowed post-hole digger, and stood in the yard long enough to get a look at Martha, who was at that moment rehanging the lean-to door that had been sagging on its hinges. She had the door off its frame, a hammer in one hand, and was examining the hinge screws with the look of a woman who was deciding something. Hank said hello to Clem, and then looked at Martha, and then looked back at Clem with an expression Clem recognized. That's Martha," Clem said. Yes." Hank watched her swing the door back and test the fit. "She doing your carpentry now?" "Door needed fixing," Martha said without looking up. She tightened the top hinge screw, tested the swing again, gave a short nod of satisfaction, and wiped her hands on her apron. Hank blinked. Martha turned around. "Are you staying for dinner, Mr. Briggs?" Hank said. "Hank Briggs. No, I know. Just returning something." "Then I won't keep you," she said pleasantly, and went back inside. Hank looked at Clem. Clem looked back at him. "Well," Hank said finally. "Yep," said Clem. Clara Birch came on Saturday with her friend Louise Pratt, and the pretense of bringing a welcome loaf of bread. It was a small loaf. Clara Birch had not baked it with any genuine generosity of spirit, and it showed in the size. Martha answered the door. Clara looked her up and down in a way that she probably thought was subtle. "You must be the new the new Clems." "Martha Dawson," Martha said. She stepped back from the door. "Come in if you'd like. I've just made coffee." They came in. They sat. They looked around the kitchen with expressions that said they'd expected to find disaster and weren't sure what to make of the fact that they hadn't. "My goodness," Louise said. It's very organized." "I find it easier to work in a kitchen I can navigate," Martha said. She poured 3 cups and set the small bread loaf on a board and cut it without comment. Clara watched her. "And where did you say you were from?" "Hayes City." "And your family?" "My father is passed. My mother before him." "I see." Clara folded her hands in her lap. "And you and Clem, you just arrived this week?" "Monday," Martha said. "And you're—" Clara paused, choosing words like she was picking through a pile for something sharp. "Settling in all right, it must be quite an adjustment. The ranch is very remote." Martha looked at her steadily. "I grew up on a ranch, Mrs. Birch. Remote suits me fine." Clara smiled. It was the kind of smile that didn't reach anything above the teeth. "Of course. I only mean it's quite a lot for someone new to take on. The house, the land, the—" She waved a hand that was meant to indicate the general difficulty of Martha's existence. Well, it's a lot. Martha set her coffee cup down. Mrs. Birch, she said very quietly, I appreciate you coming. I know it was kind of you to bring the bread. She glanced at the small loaf with the faintest acknowledgement. I want to be straightforward with you. I'm not here because I had no other choice. I'm here because I chose to be. I intend to make a good home on this ranch, and I intend to be a good neighbor. I would appreciate your friendship if you're willing to offer it, but I don't need your concern. Clara opened her mouth, closed it. Louise Pratt looked into her coffee cup like it held something very interesting. Well, Clara said finally. Yes, of course. They left 20 minutes later, not unkindly, but in a hurry. Clem had been at the barn through all of it. He came in for supper, and Martha was at the stove, and he sat down, and she put food in front of him, and for a while they ate in the silence they'd already settled into, which was not uncomfortable, just quiet. Then he said, Clara Birch came by. She did, Martha said. How'd it go? Martha considered the question. Fine, she said. He looked at her. She's a woman who's used to knowing where things stand, Martha said. She didn't know where things stood with me. Now she does. Clem put his fork down. What did you tell her? That I'm not here by accident and I'm not here to be pitied. She met his gaze. Is that all right with you? He looked at her for a long moment. This woman he'd known for less than a week, who had reorganized his kitchen and fixed his door and cooked him the best food he'd had in years, and apparently squared herself against the most formidable gossip in Abilene without breaking a sweat. More than all right, he said. She picked up her fork again. Outside, one of the steers bellowed at something in the dark, and the cottonwood trees moved in the evening wind, and the lamp on the table burned steady and warm. Clem Hadley looked at the woman sitting across from him and thought Edna Foss. You strange, brilliant woman. What exactly have you sent me? He didn't say it out loud, but for the first time in 3 years the house didn't feel empty. The morning after Clara Birch's visit, Clem woke before dawn to the sound of the stove being lit. He lay still for a moment, listening. The scrape of iron on iron. The soft thud of wood going in. Then the creak of the back door and footsteps crossing the yard toward the well. He got up. By the time he'd pulled his boots on and come into the kitchen, the fire was going and the coffee pot was on, and Martha was standing at the table with a piece of paper and a stub of pencil writing things down in a hand so small and neat it looked like print. You're up early, he said. I'm always up early, she said without looking up. Your flour is almost gone, so is your salt. You're out of lard and your cornmeal won't last another week. You need coffee beans, dried beans, and whatever salt pork the general store has that isn't from last winter. She looked up. Can you spare $1.50? Clem stared at her. For provisions. For provisions. For... He went to the tin on the shelf above the door where he kept household money. Counted out the coins. Set them on the table beside her list. She picked them up, counted them herself without apology, and tucked them into her apron pocket. I'll go to town after the morning work, she said. Is there anything you need from the feed store? I know. He sat down and reached for the coffee. You know you don't have to ask me every time you want to spend household money. I do, until we've worked out how the household money works, she said. I don't take things that aren't explicitly offered. She set her pencil down and looked at him. That's a rule I have. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. All right, he said. Then I'm explicitly offering. The tin above the door. Whatever's in it is for the house. You manage it. She held his gaze for a moment, as if she was making sure he meant it. Then she nodded, picked up her pencil, and went back to her list. Outside, the first birds started up in the cottonwoods. It was the second week of July, and the day was going to be brutal before 9 in the morning. Neither of them said anything else for a while, but there was something in that silence that was different from the silences of the week before. Not empty, not careful. Just two people in the same house, moving at the same pace, needing the same amount of quiet to start a day. Clem noticed it. He didn't mention it. He went out to the barn, and Martha went out to the garden, and the morning got going. The garden was one of the first things she'd assessed, and one of the things that had troubled her most. Clem had planted it back in May, beans, squash, some corn, but it had been left to manage itself since then, and a garden that manages itself in Kansas in July quickly decides it doesn't need to be a garden anymore. The weeds had gotten confident. The squash had sprawled where it wanted. The beans needed stakes they didn't have. Martha spent 2 hours in that garden before the heat made it unreasonable. She pulled weeds until her back ached, staked the beans with strips of old fence rail she found behind the barn, and cut away the squash runners that had gone in the wrong direction. It was not glamorous work. It was not the kind of work anyone would see or praise. She did it the same way she did everything, completely and without needing anyone to witness it. When she came in and cleaned up and started for town, she passed the north fence where Clem was working. He was wrestling a post back into vertical, tamping the earth down around its base. He'd taken his shirt off in the heat. She noticed, without particularly meaning to, that his back was built the way a man's back gets built when he's done physical labor for 20 years. Not remarkable, just true. He looked up when he heard her footsteps on the road. "Taking the path through Briggs's property," he called. "Is that all right?" "Hank won't mind. Cuts 20 minutes off the walk." "I know," she said. "I measured it on the way out Monday." He looked at her for a beat. "You measured it." "I count my steps when I walk somewhere new," she said. "It's habit." He didn't say anything to that, just picked up his post-hole bar and went back to work. She walked to town. The Abilene General Store was run by a man named Pete Garfield, who was 60 years old and had seen enough of the frontier to be unsurprised by most things. He was surprised mildly when Martha Dawson walked in, set her list on the counter, and proceeded to negotiate the price of salt pork down by 4 cents a pound, on the grounds that the barrel it was stored in had a crack in one stave that was letting in air, and she'd noticed the edges were going dry. Pete looked at his barrel, then at her, then back at the barrel. 4 cents, he said. 4 cents, she said. 3, he said. Done, she said, which meant she'd have taken 3 all along. Pete Garfield decided he liked her. He was packing her provisions when Clara Birch came in with Louise Pratt. They stopped when they saw Martha. Clara recovered first. "Why, Miss Martha?" said with a brightness that was almost sincere. "Doing your shopping?" "I am," Martha said. Clara glanced at Pete, then back. "And how are you finding everything settling in?" "Very well, thank you," Louise said in the tone of a woman who was genuinely curious despite herself. "Hank Briggs said you rehung the lean-to door on your first week." "It was dragging," Martha said simply. "He said you did it in about 20 minutes. 15, Martha said. "The screws weren't stripped. It just needed fresh holes." Louise Pratt looked at her with an expression that was edging toward actual respect. Clara Birch noticed and recalibrated. "It's wonderful when a woman is capable," Clara said with that specific inflection that turned a compliment into a condition. Of course, in a place as remote as Clem's ranch, one does need to be self-sufficient. Not everyone can manage that kind of solitude. Martha picked up her basket. She looked at Clara directly. "I'm not lonely, Mrs. Birch," she said, "if that's what you're asking." Clara blinked. "And I'm not struggling," Martha continued, still pleasant, still even. "I know you're watching for signs that I'm in over my head. I understand why. A woman my size from nowhere coming out here on a matchmaking arrangement, it makes a good story if it goes wrong." She adjusted the basket on her arm. "It's not going to go wrong, but I appreciate your interest." She said goodbye to Pete Garfield, nodded to Louise, and walked out. The bell above the door hadn't finished ringing before Louise Pratt said in a hushed and frankly admiring voice, "Lord Clara." Clara Birch said nothing. When Martha got back to the ranch, she found a horse tied at the post that hadn't been there when she'd left, a big gray with a cavalry brand on its hip, and good tack, which meant money, which meant someone important. She went inside and found Clem at the table with a man she didn't know. The man was about 50 broad through the shoulders, wearing a coat that had once been expensive and still tried to act like it was. He had the look of a man who was accustomed to being the most significant person in any given room. Clem stood up when she came in. "Martha," he said. "This is Judge Roy Callum. He has land east of mine. Judge, this is Martha Dawson." Callum stood out of courtesy or instinct and looked at her with the particular assessment of a man who was deciding how much to account for a person. "Miss Dawson," he said, "Clem's been telling me you've taken the place well in hand." "I've been here 10 days, Martha said. She set her basket on the counter and began unpacking it. "I wouldn't claim much in 10 days. He says you reorganized the provisions and the kitchen and the garden." "The garden needed attention," she said. "The kitchen needed logic." Callum watched her hands moving efficient and quick. "Where are you from?" "Hayes City." "Your people?" "Gone," she said. He nodded slowly. There was a pause in which he was clearly deciding something. "I'll get to the point then," he said. "I'm not here for a social call." He looked at Clem. "There's been talk." Clem's jaw tightened. "Talk about what?" "About your east boundary. Old Herschel Pratt, Louise's father-in-law, died this spring. He had a claim on 40 acres of your east pasture going back to 71, filed in the county records but never pressed. Now his son is talking about pressing it." The kitchen went quiet. Martha kept unpacking her basket, but more slowly. "That's my land," Clem said. "I've worked that pasture for 11 years. "I know it," Callum said. "And there's a good chance the county records support you. But Warren Pratt has hired himself a lawyer from Wichita, and a lawyer from Wichita with a 7-year-old filing is not something to take lightly." Martha set the last of the provisions on the shelf and turned around. "What does the original deed say?" she asked. Both men looked at her. "Clem's deed," she said. "From when he filed." "What are the exact boundary descriptions?" Clem said slowly. "North to the creek, east to the old survey stake by the cottonwood stand, south along the fence line west to the road." "And the Pratt filing?" Callum looked at her with something new in his expression. "Claims the east boundary runs 30 feet short of the cottonwood stake." 30 feet, Martha said. "Is the stake still there?" "As far as I know," Clem said. "Then the stake is your evidence," she said. "An original survey stake in the ground beats a 7-year-old filing in a county office, especially if the deed references it by name." She looked at Callum. "Doesn't it?" Callum was quiet for a moment. "Generally speaking, yes." "Then before Clem spends money on his own lawyer, someone should ride out to that stake and make sure it's exactly where the deed says it is, and someone should get a look at the Pratt filing before it becomes a formal claim." She paused. "Is it a formal claim yet?" "Not yet," Callum said. "Warren's made noise. Nothing filed." "Then there's time," Martha said. "And it costs nothing to verify the stake." She looked at Clem. "Do you want me to ride out with you tomorrow and find it?" Clem had been watching her through all of this with an expression she couldn't quite read. It wasn't surprise exactly. It was something quieter than that. "Yeah," he said. "I do." Callum looked at Martha for a long moment. Then he said to no one in particular, "Edna Foss does good work." Martha turned back to the stove and said nothing. But the corner of her mouth moved just slightly, and she didn't try to stop it. They rode out to the east pasture at first light. The survey stake was there. Right where the deed said it was a cedar post, sun-bleached and iron hard, with the original survey notch cut into the top. Martha got down off the horse and crouched beside it, and looked at the notch, then looked up at the cottonwood stand, then looked back at the stake. "How far would 30 feet get you?" she asked. Clem paced it off. 30 feet west of the stake put you squarely in the middle of the best grazing section of the east pasture, the flat ground near the creek bend where the grass came in thicker because of the water table. He stopped. "They knew exactly what they were claiming," he said. "Yes," Martha said. She stood up, looked at the stake, looked at him. "Write this down tonight," she said. "The stake number, if there is one, the notch description, the exact distance from the cottonwood stand. If it goes to a hearing, you want a record made before any dispute officially opens." "Where did you learn this?" he asked. She brushed the dust off her hands. "My father lost 10 acres to a bad boundary dispute in '68, she said. "We couldn't prove the stake. We lost the land and the income from it, and things were hard for 2 years after." She looked at him. "I learned from that." Clem was quiet for a moment. A meadowlark called from somewhere in the pasture one long liquid note. "Martha," he said. She looked at him. "I want you to know." He stopped, started again. "I wrote that letter the way I wrote it because I thought I was being honest about what I needed. Practical, no fuss. I didn't want to. I didn't think I needed anything more than that." She waited. She had learned already that Clem Hadley got to his point eventually, but you had to give him room. "I think I was wrong about what I needed," he said. The meadowlark called again. The grass moved in the early breeze. "We've got time to figure that out," she said. She picked up her horse's reins and swung back up into the saddle and started back toward the ranch. He stood there another moment, his hand on his horse's neck, looking at the stake and the cottonwood stand and the 40 acres of grassland that was his, that had always been his. Then he got back on his horse and followed her home. Warren Pratt came by 2 days later. He didn't come alone. He brought a man named Dillard, who carried a leather satchel and had the soft hands and precise manner of a lawyer who had recently arrived from somewhere larger and better funded than Abilene. Martha was on the porch when they rode up. She had a bushel of green beans she was working through, snapping the ends. She kept working when they stopped their horses in the yard. "Morning," Warren said. He was 40, thick-necked, with the residual confidence of a man who had always been bigger than the people around him. "Clem in?" "He's at the barn?" Martha said. "I'll get him. Or you can tell me what you came for, and I'll pass it on." Warren looked at her for a beat. His expression said he had heard about her and had already made his decision about what she was. "I'll wait for Clem," he said. "All right," she said pleasantly and kept snapping beans. Dillard, the lawyer, shifted in his saddle. He was looking at Martha with a different kind of attention, the kind that was calculating rather than dismissive. Clem came out of the barn and walked across the yard. He stopped a few feet from their horses. "Warren," he said. "Clem." Warren gestured toward Dillard. "This is Mr. Dillard. He represents the Pratt estate in regard to my father's claim on your east pasture." "I'm aware of the claim," Clem said. "Then you know we intend to formalize it. Mr. Dillard has reviewed the county records and the filing is solid." "The filing is 7 years old and was never pressed," Clem said. "My father was a patient man," Warren said. "I'm less so." Martha set down her beans. "Mr. Pratt," she said, "what does your father's filing give as the east boundary of the disputed section?" Both men looked at her. Warren's jaw tightened. "I don't believe I was talking to you, ma'am," he said. "You weren't," she said. "But I'm talking to you, the boundary description. What does it say?" Dillard glanced at Warren. Warren gave a short nod, the nod of a man who has decided to be tolerant because he thinks he's winning. Dillard opened his satchel and unfolded a document. "The Pratt filing describes the eastern boundary as running from the creek north to a point 30 feet west of the standing survey stake, thence north to the property line." 30 feet west of the stake, Martha said. "Not 30 feet east." Dillard paused. "That's what it says, yes." "Then the filing describes a boundary that would put the disputed section on Mr. Pratt's own property, not Mr. Hadley's." She looked at him steadily. "West of the stake is Pratt land. East of the stake is Hadley land. Your filing claims 30 feet of Mr. Pratt's own acreage." Silence. Dillard looked at the document again. His face did something complicated. "That," he looked at Warren, "that would be a surveyor's error in the original filing." "It would," Martha said, "which means the filing as written doesn't support the claim being made. You'd need an amended filing which would open the whole matter to county review, at which point Mr. Hadley's deed and the original stake description would be entered into evidence. She picked up her beans again. I'd think carefully before formalizing anything, Mr. Dillard. A bad filing that gets reviewed is worse than no filing at all. Clem said nothing. He stood with his hands at his sides and watched Warren Pratt's face go through several colors. We'll need to review this further, Dillard said with the careful diction of a man who has just been made aware of a problem he is going to have to manage. Of course, Martha said. Warren Pratt looked at her with something that was not quite anger and not quite admiration. It was the look of a man who had ridden out expecting a fence to lean on and found a stone wall instead. Where'd you study law? He said. I didn't, she said. I just read things carefully. They left. Clem waited until they were out of earshot. Then he turned around and looked at Martha on the porch, with her beans in her lap, and her hands steady, and her expression exactly the same as it had been before they arrived. Martha, he said. She said. Did you know about that error before they got here? I suspected it, she said. When Judge Callum said 30 feet, I thought a man filing a claim writes his boundary from his own property line outward, not from his neighbor's stake inward. So I thought there was a chance the direction was backwards. I wasn't certain until Dillard read it out. Clem crossed the yard and sat down on the porch step below her. He put his elbows on his knees and looked at the road where the Pratt horses had gone. I've been working that land for 11 years, he said. I almost lost it today. No, she said. You almost lost it 7 years ago when the filing was made and nobody caught the error. Today, you kept it. She snapped another bean. There's a difference. He looked up at her. She was watching the road, her hands moving in their steady rhythm, and there was something in her profile. The set of her jaw, the steadiness in her eyes that made something in Clem's chest pull in a direction he hadn't expected. He looked away before she could see it. I'm going to write to Judge Callum tonight, he said. Tell him what happened. Good, she said. Tell him to pull the original Pratt filing from county records and have the directional error noted formally. Even if Warren drops the claim you wanted on record. I will. He stood up. I'll start supper tonight, he said. You've been working since before sunup. She looked at him with something that was almost surprise. You cook, she said. I cooked for 3 years by myself, he said. I'm not as good as you, but I can make a reasonable bean soup. That's a low bar, she said. I know, he said, and he almost smiled. Almost. She caught it. And this time she let herself smile back just briefly. Just a little, just enough that he could see it, before she looked back down at her beans. It was the first real smile she'd given anyone since she'd stepped off that train. Clem Hadley went inside to start supper, and he did not examine what he was feeling, because he was a practical man, and this was only the 3rd week, and there was a fence to mend, and a formal boundary record to file, and 63 head of cattle that needed moving to the draw before the grass ran out. But that night, after the dishes were washed and the lamp turned down, he lay in the dark and listened to the quiet house, and thought that it didn't feel like a quiet house anymore. It felt like a home. And he had not been expecting that, not even a little bit. 3 weeks into July, and the heat had turned mean. It came in off the plains like something with intent pressing down on everything, the cattle, the garden, the people. The well held, but just. Clem was hauling extra water to the stock twice a day, and Martha was doing the same for the garden bucket by bucket, because if the squash and beans gave out in August, they'd be buying provisions through September, and the household tin couldn't sustain that. She didn't complain about it. She didn't complain about anything. That was one of the things Clem had learned about Martha Dawson. In 3 weeks, she assessed a problem, made a plan, and executed the plan. There was no wasted motion and no wasted breath. What he had not expected was how much that would make him want to know what was happening inside her head. He caught himself watching her sometimes. At the table when she was reading, she had brought 3 books in her trunk, which surprised him, and she read in the evenings with the kind of concentration that said she had been doing it all her life. at the garden when she was working the rows, at the stove. He'd catch himself looking and then look away quickly the way you look away from something bright. He didn't examine it. He was a practical man. But the morning she came running in from the barn at 4:30 in the morning and grabbed his shoulder in the dark and said, "Clem, it's the Harmon heifer, she's down and something's wrong." He was already sitting up before she'd finished the sentence. He was pulling his boots on before his eyes were fully open. "How long?" he said. "I don't know. I got up for water and went to check on her because she was restless yesterday afternoon." Martha was already moving back toward the door. "She's been in labor, but it's been too long. The calf isn't coming right." They ran. The heifer, a young red cow first calf that Clem had paid good money for at the spring auction, was down on her side in the far stall, and the situation was immediately clear to anyone who knew cattle. She'd been working too long. The calf was positioned wrong, and she was exhausted, and her breathing had gone ragged in a way that meant time was running out. Clem was on his knees beside her in seconds. He felt along her side, his jaw tight. "She's been at this 3 hours at least," he said. "Can you turn it?" "I have to." He looked up at Martha. "I need you to hold the lantern steady and do exactly what I tell you. This is going to be bad before it gets better. Can you do that?" She was already holding the lantern level, both hands completely steady. "Tell me what to do," she said. He told her. What followed was the longest hour of that summer. Clem worked with his hands and his whole weight and everything he knew about cattle, which was considerable. While Martha held the lantern and talked to the heifer in a low, continuous voice, not panicked, not sentimental, just steady. "You're all right. You're doing fine. Keep going. Keep going. The way you talk to something that needs to hear a human voice and can't understand words but knows the difference between fear and calm." Clem noticed it. He was elbow deep in the most difficult calving he'd had in 5 years, and he noticed her voice and the effect it had on the animal, and he filed it away in the part of his mind that was collecting things about Martha Dawson that he hadn't bargained for. "It's coming," he said. "I've got it. Come here. I need your hands." She set the lantern down, dropped to her knees in the straw beside him, and put her hands where he told her without hesitation or visible disgust. She pulled when he told her to pull. She held when he told her to hold. The calf came into the world at 20 minutes past 5 in the morning, all at once, and lay still. Clem's heart dropped. Martha was already moving. She grabbed the rough sack hanging on the stall post and went at the calf, with both hands rubbing hard fast, working the ribs. "Come on," she said low and fierce. "Come on." The calf shuddered, breathed, lifted its head. The heifer made a sound that was almost human. Clem sat back on his heels, covered in evidence of the last hour, and breathed for what felt like the first time. Martha sat back too. She looked at the calf, who was already trying to figure out what its legs were for. She was filthy. Her braid had come half undone. She had straw in her hair, and she was breathing hard, and her hands were shaking just slightly with the aftermath of effort and adrenaline. She didn't seem to notice any of that. She was looking at the calf with an expression that was completely unguarded, open and soft and lit from inside, and Clem Hadley saw it, and something in his chest made a decision without consulting him. He didn't say anything. He couldn't have said anything sensible if he'd tried. After a moment, Martha became aware of him watching her, and the expression closed back down into its usual steadiness. "She needs water," she said about the heifer. "And we should check for retained." "Martha," he said. She stopped. "Thank you," he said. It was a simple thing. 2 words. But the way he said them, like they were carrying more than 2 words worth of weight, made her go still for a moment. "You would have managed without me," she said finally. "No," he said. "I wouldn't have. Not as well. Maybe not at all." She looked at him. He looked back. The calf made an unsteady attempt at standing, failed, tried again. Martha stood up, brushed the straw off her knees, and went to get the heifer water, but her hands had stopped shaking. Judge Roy Callum came by that afternoon, and he did not come alone. He brought Pete Garfield from the general store and a man named Aldous Webb, who was the county land recorder and who had ridden 12 miles from the county seat on what he kept referring to as urgent business. Clem met them in the yard. Martha came out of the house drying her hands on her apron, and something about the look on Callum's face told her this was not a social call. "What's happened?" Clem said. Callum took his hat off. "Warren Pratt filed this morning," he said. "He didn't amend the boundary error. He filed the original claim exactly as it was, directional error and all, and he found himself a judge in Wichita who signed a provisional order recognizing the claim pending a county hearing." The silence in the yard was absolute. "He can't do that," Clem said. "The filing is wrong. Martha found—" "I know what Martha found," Callum said. "The problem is the provisional order. Until the county hearing, you can't use the east pasture. Your cattle will have to come off that section." Clem's jaw worked. "That's 30 head of cattle in my best grazing. I can't sustain the herd on what's left through August." "I know," Callum said. Aldous Webb, who had the uncomfortable manner of a man delivering news he didn't like delivering, cleared his throat. "There's more," he said. "Warren's lawyer, this Dillard, he filed a secondary claim on the creek access. If that one gets a provisional too, you lose your primary water source." Martha said very quietly, "When is the hearing?" Everyone looked at her. "The county hearing," she said. "When is it scheduled?" 3 weeks. Webb said. "August 9th. And the provisional on the creek claim, has it been signed?" "Not yet. Dillard filed yesterday afternoon. The Wichita judge would have to review it separately." "How long does that review take?" "Typically 4 or 5 days." Martha looked at Clem. "Then we have 4 days to file a counter-objection to the creek claim before it gets a provisional. If we can block the provisional on the water, we protect the herd through the hearing." Webb stared at her. "A counter-objection has to be filed at the county seat." "I know," she said. "What do you need to file one?" "A sworn statement from the landowner, the original deed with water rights notation, and a registered witness signature." Martha turned to Callum. "Is the water rights notation in Clem's deed?" Callum was looking at her the way he'd looked at her the first time, with that recalibrating expression, like he kept having to adjust his estimate of her upward. "It is," he said. "Standard notation for creek-adjacent property." "Then we can file," she said. She looked at Clem. "Ride to the county seat tomorrow morning, first light. Take the deed and sign the sworn statement there. I'll write up a summary of the boundary error and the directional discrepancy. Tonight you take that with you as supporting documentation. Judge Callum, will you be the registered witness?" Callum put his hat back on. "I will," he said. Pete Garfield said in the voice of a man who was watching something he wanted to remember. "Clem, where exactly did Edna Foss find this woman?" Clem didn't answer. He was looking at Martha. "It might not work," Martha said directly to him because she was always honest with him. "The judge in Wichita may sign the provisional before we get there, but it's the best move we have right now." "I know," he said. "We do it." That evening, Martha sat at the kitchen table and wrote. She wrote for 3 hours by lamplight in that small, precise hand of hers, laying out the boundary discrepancy in plain language, citing the original deed description, the survey stake location, and the directional error in the Pratt filing. She cited the specific legal principle she'd found it in a land law pamphlet she'd borrowed from Callum's office, that an error in a boundary direction in a filed claim invalidated the acreage calculation derived from it. Clem sat across from her and watched her work. He didn't interrupt. He got up once to refill her coffee and set it beside her without comment, and she said thank you, without looking up, and he sat back down. At some point past 9 o'clock, she set her pen down and pressed her fingers against her eyes and rolled her neck. "You should sleep," he said. "In a minute." She looked at the pages, 6 of them filled front and back. "Tell me again about the stake. The exact distance from the cottonwood stand." 23 paces northeast, he said. "I measured it the day we rode out." "Your pace is about 2.5 feet, she said, which she had evidently calculated at some earlier point. That's roughly 57 feet from the stand to the stake. The deed says 50 feet. There's a 7-foot variance. Is that a problem? It could be if someone argues the stake has shifted, she said. But cedar posts in hard Kansas ground don't shift. I'll note the depth of the set. How deep was it? 2 feet minimum, he said. Maybe more. I tried to move it when we were out there just to test. It didn't move. She wrote that down. Good, she said. That's in the statement. Martha. He leaned forward, his forearms on the table. Why are you doing all this? She looked up. You came here to keep house, he said. To cook and manage the domestic work, not to fight land claims. She held his gaze. I came here to make a home, she said. There's a difference. A home doesn't exist without the land it's on. She paused. And you're not the only one with something at stake here. If the ranch fails, I have nowhere to go, so I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it for both of us. He was quiet. That's honest, he said finally. I told you at the beginning, she said. I'm always honest with you. He nodded slowly. Then he said, I know. That's not I know. He stopped, started again. I just wanted to make sure you knew that I know it matters. What you're doing, that I see it. Something moved in her face. Not the almost smile from before. Something quieter and more serious than that. I know you see it, she said. Clem rode to the county seat at first light with the deed and Martha's 6 pages of documentation and Judge Callum's witness signature on the sworn statement. Martha spent the day managing the herd's movement off the east pasture, 29 cattle, since 4 of the calves were too small to drive far, maneuvering them through the gate and into the north draw, where the grass was shorter but adequate. She did it alone on horseback because Clem was gone, and Hank Briggs had offered help, but she'd told him she could manage. She could manage. It took 4 hours, and by the end her back was screaming, and the horse was tired, and the cattle were annoyed, but they were in the draw, and the gate was latched. She was watering the horse at the trough when Clara Birch rode up in her buggy. Martha didn't say anything. She waited. Clara climbed down from the buggy and stood in the yard with an expression that Martha couldn't immediately read. Not the bright social performance from before. Something more uncertain. I heard about the Pratt claim, Clara said. Word travels, Martha said. I also heard what you said to Dillard on the porch. Warren told Louise and Louise... Clara stopped. Everyone's heard. Martha kept watering the horse. Is there something you needed, Mrs. Birch? Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said in a different voice than Martha had heard from her before, smaller and less armored, My husband has a letter from Warren Pratt asking for a signed statement in support of the claim. Character statement about Clem, implying Clem's management of the ranch has been negligent. Martha went still. The Reverend hasn't signed it, Clara said quickly. He won't sign it, but he received it, and I thought you should know. Martha turned around and looked at Clara fully. Clara was not comfortable. She was standing with her hands clasped in front of her, and there was something in her face that looked like the first honest thing Martha had seen there. Why are you telling me? Martha asked. Because... Clara stopped, started again. Because I came here twice trying to find out if you were going to fail, and you haven't failed, and I don't... She looked away briefly. I don't think you deserve to have the ground cut out from under you by Warren Pratt and a hired lawyer. Martha looked at her for a long moment. Who else got that letter? She said. Pete Garfield, Hank Briggs, Tom and Alice Myers from the South Road. Did any of them sign it? Not that I know of. Pete threw his in the trash from what I hear. Martha nodded slowly. Is there anything in the letter about the creek claim? It mentions the water rights. Says Clem's usage of the creek has encroached on Pratt watershed. That was a new angle. Martha had not anticipated that, and for a moment she felt the cold edge of it, the realization that Dillard was not just filing a boundary claim, he was building a broader narrative about Clem's conduct as a landowner. Thank you, Martha said, to Clara directly without qualification. This matters. Thank you for telling me. Clara nodded. She looked like a woman who'd done something slightly larger than herself and wasn't sure how to carry it. I'll be getting back then, she said. Mrs. Birch, Martha said. Clara turned. The friendship I mentioned when you first came, Martha said. I meant it. It's still on offer. Clara Birch looked at her, and for the first time since Martha had stepped off that train, something in Clara's face settled into something genuine. I'll take it, she said. Clem came home after dark. He came in tired and dusty, and he sat down at the table, and Martha put food in front of him and sat across from him and said, How did it go? Filed, he said. Counter-objection is on record. Webb says it'll reach the Wichita judge by day after tomorrow, whether it gets there before the provisional signs. He shook his head. No way to know. Martha told him about Clara's visit, about the Pratt letters to the townspeople, about the Creek narrative Dillard was building. Clem's expression went through several stages. He set his fork down when she was done. He's not just trying to take 40 acres, he said. No, Martha said. He's trying to establish that you've been a bad steward of the land adjacent to his. If he can get enough signed statements, he can argue the creek access has been mismanaged and the boundary has been functionally, if not legally, in dispute for years. She paused. It's a stronger play than a simple filing. It would take longer and cost more, but it puts you on the defensive in ways the original claim doesn't. How do I fight that? You don't fight it, Martha said. You make it untrue. You go to every person he wrote to Pete Hank the Myers, and you ask them directly what they think of your stewardship. Not to sign anything, just to talk. Because the hearing in 3 weeks is not just a legal proceeding. It's about what this community believes about who you are. Clem was quiet for a long time. And what do they believe? He said. Martha looked at him steadily. 3 weeks ago, she said, you were the quiet man on the 600 acres who hadn't quite recovered from losing his wife. Decent enough, kept to himself. She held his gaze. That's changed. Pete Garfield threw that letter in the trash. Hank Briggs offered to help me move cattle today without being asked. Clara Birch drove out here to warn us. She paused. People are watching this ranch differently than they were a month ago. Clem absorbed that. Because of you, he said. Because of what's happening here, she said. That's not the same thing. It was, though, and they both knew it. It was different, and they both knew why. Clem picked his fork back up. He ate. She sat across from him and drank her coffee, and outside the summer night, pressed down on everything hot and close and full of the sounds of the Kansas plains. Martha, he said after a while. The heifer and the calf, he said. I'm naming the calf. She looked up. I'm naming her Martha, he said. He said it straight without any deflection or apology. If that's all right with you. She looked at him for a long moment. Her face did the thing it rarely did. Fully opened, unguarded, the same expression he'd seen when the calf had lifted its head in the straw at 5 in the morning. That's all right with me, she said very quietly. Outside, somewhere in the dark of the north, 30 cattle settled into the grass that Martha Dawson had moved them to, single-handedly 4 hours of hard riding in July heat, without complaint and without witness. And inside that house on 600 acres of Kansas plain, 2 people who had come together for entirely practical reasons sat across a kitchen table in a silence that had stopped being empty so gradually that neither of them could have said exactly when it changed. But it had changed, and there was no going back from it now. The provisional order on the creek claim never got signed. Aldous Webb rode out on a Thursday morning, 4 days after Clem had filed the counter-objection, and he had the look of a man carrying news he was genuinely glad to deliver. The Wichita judge had reviewed the counter-objection and Martha's 6 pages of documentation and had declined to sign the provisional pending the county hearing. The creek access stayed open. The herd stayed watered. Clem got the news at the barn and stood there with his hand on the doorframe for a moment, not saying anything. Webb waited. The boundary claim, Clem said. The East Pasture provisional does this affect that? Not directly. Webb said. That one's already signed. But the fact that the second provisional was denied, that's going to matter at the hearing. A judge who looked at the full documentation and said, "No," sends a message about the quality of the Pratt filing overall. Clem nodded. August 9th. August 9th. Webb confirmed. County Courthouse. Be there at 9. He left. Clem went inside. Martha was at the table with her mending, and she looked up when he came in, and she read his face before he said a word. "The creek," she said. "Denied," he said. "We keep the water." She set her mending down, pressed her hands flat on the table, closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds, then opened them and picked her mending back up. "Good," she said. "Now we prepare for the 9th. That was Martha. No celebration, no drama, just the next thing. Clem pulled out a chair and sat down across from her. "What does preparing look like?" "It looks like you talking to people," she said. "Hank Briggs, the Myers, Pete Garfield. Not about the claim specifically, about the ranch, about what they've seen here. The hearing isn't a trial, it's a review. The county recorder weighs the documents, but a community's account of a man's character and his stewardship carries weight at a county level. Callum told me that." "When did you talk to Callum?" "Yesterday, when you were moving the calves." She didn't look up from her needle. "He also said Dillard is planning to argue that the boundary has been functionally ambiguous for years, that your usage of the east pasture was never formally established against the Pratt claim. We need witnesses who can speak to your continuous use of that land." "Hank Briggs has seen me work that pasture since I bought the place," Clem said. "I know. Ask him. And ask him to think about specific years, specific seasons. Dillard will be precise. Our witnesses need to be precise too." She finally looked up. "And Clem, you need to speak for yourself at that hearing. Not just let the document speak. You need to stand up and tell that county recorder what that land means and how long you've worked it. In plain language, no hesitation." He looked at her. "I'm not much for public speaking." "I know," she said. "We'll practice." He blinked. "You want me to practice a speech?" "I want you to practice saying true things out loud until they come out without hesitation," she said. "There's a difference." She set her mending aside entirely and folded her hands on the table. "Tell me right now, how long have you worked the east pasture?" 11 years. "What have you run on it?" "Cattle, rotated with the draw and the north section on a 6-week cycle." "Have you ever had a boundary dispute with the Pratt property before?" "Never. Herschel Pratt and I shared that line for 9 years without a word between us." "Did Herschel Pratt ever indicate to you in any form that he considered that acreage in dispute?" Clem paused. Something shifted in his face. "No," he said. "He wait." He stopped. Martha waited. "The summer of 74, Clem said slowly. "Herschel came over to help me pull a steer out of the creek mud. We were right there at the east boundary. He looked at the stake and he said, 'Good solid post Hadley. That'll stand 100 years. He said it like it was settled, like it was mine." Martha looked at him. "That's your testimony," she said quietly. "That's the moment you describe at the hearing. Herschel Pratt standing at the stake in 1874, acknowledging your boundary without dispute. A dead man's son can file a claim. He cannot contradict a living man's memory of a dead man's words." Clem sat back. Is that enough? Combined with the deed, the stake, the directional error in the filing, the denied creek provisional, and Hank Briggs testifying to 11 years of continuous use. She held his gaze. "It should be more than enough." He looked at her, this woman who had arrived on a train 5 weeks ago with one trunk and a practical dress, and had proceeded to save his land, his water, and possibly his future, and something in him gave way quietly like a knot, finally loosing. "Martha," he said. "Don't," she said before he could continue. "Don't what?" "Don't thank me again," she said. "I know you're grateful. I can see it. You don't need to keep saying it." "That's not what I was going to say," he said. She looked at him. "I was going to ask you, he said carefully, "if you're happy here." The question landed between them and stayed there. Martha was very still for a moment. It was the particular stillness of a person who has been asked something they were not prepared to be asked. "I'm useful here," she said finally. "That's not what I asked." She looked down at her folded hands. It's a hard question to answer when you've never been in a place long enough to know the difference. He didn't push. He wasn't a man who pushed. He let the silence sit. After a moment, she said quietly, "The morning with the calf." When she stood up, she paused. "I was happy then." Clem nodded, like that was enough. Like that was in fact more than enough. "Good," he said, and he got up and went back to the barn. The week before the hearing moved fast and strange. Hank Briggs said yes before Clem finished asking, and volunteered 3 specific memories of the East pasture going back to 1872. Tom Meyer, who was a quiet man of few words, said he'd testify to Clem's fence maintenance along the Pratt line, which he'd observed for 8 years from his own property to the south. Pete Garfield offered a merchant's account he'd been selling Clem winter feed and cattle provisions specific to the East pasture for a decade, quantities that only made sense if the man was running cattle on that acreage continuously. And then, something happened that nobody had planned for. Louise Pratt came to the ranch. She came alone without Clara, without warning on a Tuesday afternoon. She tied her horse at the post and knocked on the door, and when Martha answered, Louise said without preamble, "I need to talk to you, not Clem, you." Martha stepped back and let her in. Louise sat down. She was a small woman, neat and contained, and she looked like a person who had been arguing with herself for several days and had finally landed on a side. "Warren is my brother-in-law," she said. "My husband's brother. I want you to understand that before I say anything else." "I understand," Martha said. "My husband doesn't know I'm here," Louise said, "and I need it to stay that way." Martha sat down across from her and said nothing, which was the right thing to do. Louise took a breath. "My father-in-law, old Herschel, he talked about that boundary filing twice in my memory. Once when he made it in 71 and once about 2 years before he died." She paused. "The second time he told my husband it was a mistake. That he'd filed it in a moment of bad feeling over a cattle dispute that resolved itself and that he'd never intended to press it. He said the land was Hadley's and always had been." The kitchen was completely silent. "He said that," Martha said carefully, "to your husband." "Yes." "Does your husband remember it that way?" Louise's jaw tightened. "My husband remembers it. He's chosen not to mention it because Warren is—" She stopped. "Warren is pressing this for money. He needs money. The Pratt estate has debts that weren't public knowledge, and 40 acres of good Hadley grazing land would solve them." She looked at Martha directly. "My husband is not a bad man, but he is a man who finds it easier to follow his brother than to contradict him." Martha was quiet for a moment, turning this over. "Louise," she said, "what your father-in-law said to your husband, would your husband testify to that at the hearing?" "No," Louise said. "He won't contradict Warren in public." "Then what are you telling me this for?" Louise folded her hands in her lap. "Because you should know," she said. "Because you need to understand that Dillard knows about it too. Warren told him, and Dillard told Warren it couldn't come up at the hearing as long as no one else raised it. The lawyer knows his client's father recanted the claim, and he's proceeding anyway." Martha felt the weight of that settle over her like something cold. A lawyer who knew the underlying claim was made in bad faith, who knew the original filer had privately abandoned it, who was proceeding on behalf of a client who needed money more than he needed justice. "Will you tell me that again?" Martha said slowly, "with Judge Roy Callum sitting in this room." Louise looked at her for a long moment. "If he comes here," Louise said, "if he comes to me, I won't go to the courthouse and I won't sit in a public hearing. But if he comes here, I'll tell him what I told you." "That's enough," Martha said. "That's more than enough." She stood up and put the coffee pot on and said, "You'll stay for coffee," which was not a question, and Louise Pratt said yes, in the voice of a woman who had done the right thing and needed a moment to feel the weight of it lift. Callum came that evening. He sat across from Louise Pratt at Clem's kitchen table, and he listened, and when she was done, he sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "Dillard knows," he said. "According to Louise," Martha said. "Yes." Callum looked at Clem. "This changes things at the hearing. I can't use Louise's testimony because she won't give it publicly. But I can use what she's told us to anticipate Dillard's strategy and close off the angles he's counting on." He paused. "More than that, if it can be established that the claimant's own counsel knew the underlying claim was abandoned by the original filer and proceeded anyway, that is not a legal error. That is misconduct." Clem leaned forward. "Can you prove it?" "Not today," Callum said. "But at a county hearing, a judge can ask Dillard directly whether he had any knowledge of the original filer's intent regarding the claim. If he lies, and it comes out later, his client loses everything, and Dillard faces the Bar Association." He looked at Louise. "If he tells the truth—" "The claim collapses," Martha said. "Yes," Callum said. He put his hat back on. "I'll be filing a motion tomorrow morning to compel Dillard's disclosure of any communications regarding the original claimant's intent. He'll fight it, but the motion itself puts him on notice that we know." Louise stood up to leave. At the door she paused and looked at Martha. "I should have come sooner," she said. "You came," Martha said. "That's what matters." Louise nodded once and left. Callum followed close behind, already thinking out loud about procedural motions. The kitchen settled back into quiet. Clem was at the table, both hands around his coffee cup, staring at nothing in particular. "A lawyer who knew," he said. "Yes," Martha said. "He sat on my porch," Clem said, "with his leather satchel, telling me my land wasn't mine, knowing the man who filed the claim had changed his mind years before." "Yes," Martha said again. Clem was quiet for a long moment. Then he said with a steadiness that was worse than anger, "I want that on record." "It will be," Martha said. "Callum will see to it." He looked at her. "And if it isn't? If Dillard lies and it doesn't come out? If the hearing goes wrong?" Martha held his gaze without flinching. "Then we find another way," she said. "But Clem, it's not going to go wrong. You have the deed, the stake, 11 years of witnesses, a denied provisional, and now the knowledge that their own lawyer is standing on bad ground." She paused. "Warren Pratt needs money. He doesn't have truth. Those are not the same weapon, and truth is the heavier one." Clem looked at her for a long, long moment. In the lamplight, with the summer night pressing in through the open window and the sound of cattle settling in the draw, he looked at this woman who had come to him as a practical arrangement and had become something he did not have a word for yet, something that lived in the space between gratitude and need and the particular ache of wanting a thing you hadn't known you were missing. He almost said it then. He could feel the shape of the words. They were there, ready true. But he was Clem Hadley, and he did not rush things, and the hearing was 8 days away, and there would be time. There would be time. "Get some sleep," he said. "We've got a lot of work before the 9th. Martha nodded and started clearing the cups. And if she had felt the shape of what he hadn't said, if she had heard the weight of it in the particular way he'd looked at her. Just then, she kept that to herself in the private place. She kept things that weren't yet ready to be spoken. But she was smiling just slightly when she turned toward the basin, just slightly, and she didn't try to stop it. The 8 days before the hearing passed, the way hard days do fast in the doing and slow in the remembering. Clem talked to his neighbors. Not formally, not with any prepared speech, just man to man the way things got done on the Kansas plain. He rode to Hank Briggs and sat on his porch, and talked about the east pasture, the way two men talk about land they both know, specific and plain. He went to Tom Meyer, and they walked the south fence line together, while Tom recalled year by year the maintenance Clem had kept on that boundary. He stopped in at Pete Garfield's store, and Pete pulled out his ledger books without being asked, and showed 11 years of feed and provision sales tied to the east section, every entry dated and notated in Pete's meticulous hand. Each of those conversations steadied something in Clem. Not because they were building a case, though they were, but because they reminded him that 11 years of honest work had been witnessed even when he hadn't known anyone was watching. Martha spent those 8 days writing. She reorganized the documentation into a single coherent packet deed, stake description, directional error analysis. Denied provisional record the timeline of Herschel Pratt's original filing and its subsequent silence. She cross-referenced every document against every other document, and when she found a gap or an ambiguity, she flagged it and filled it. She worked at the kitchen table until the lamp burned low and Clem made her stop. He did that twice, stood in the kitchen doorway and said quietly, "That's enough for tonight." And both times she looked up like she'd forgotten what time it was, which she had, and both times she put the pen down without argument. That surprised her about herself. She was not a woman who took direction easily. But something about the way he said it, not commanding, not indulging, just steady and certain and caring, made it feel less like being told, and more like being looked after. She hadn't been looked after in a long time. She put the pen down and went to bed, and lay in the dark thinking about that, and about what it meant that a practical arrangement had grown into something that no longer fit neatly inside the word practical, and she didn't have a resolution for it, so she filed it alongside the other things that weren't ready to be spoken and went to sleep. The night before the hearing, neither of them slept much. Clem was up at 3, and Martha heard him and got up too, and they sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee in the dark without saying a great deal. At some point he said, "Tell me the worst case." She looked at him across the table. "Dillard lies. The recorder accepts the filing at face value. You lose the East pasture. And then we appeal to the territorial court. Callum has already told me the grounds. It takes longer and costs more, but the appeal succeeds because the directional error in the filing is not a matter of interpretation. It is a mathematical fact." She paused. "But it won't come to that." "How do you know?" "Because Dillard is a lawyer from Wichita, not a fool," she said. "And Callum filed that disclosure motion. Dillard knows we know about Herschel's recantation. A lawyer who proceeds to a county hearing, knowing his opponent knows about misconduct in the underlying claim, is a lawyer who is calculating whether the risk is worth the fee." She looked at Clem directly. "I don't think Warren Pratt is paying him enough for that risk." Clem was quiet for a moment. "And if he is, then we find out at 9 o'clock this morning, and we deal with it." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "Clem, whatever happens today, the land is documented, the stake is standing, and 11 years of honest work doesn't disappear because of a bad filing. Truth doesn't expire." He looked at her. In the dark kitchen with the pre-dawn quiet outside and the lamp burning low between them, he looked at her the way he had been looking at her more and more often, like a man who has found something he didn't know he was searching for, and is only now beginning to understand what finding it means. "No," he said. "It doesn't." They rode to the county seat together at first light. The county courthouse was a single large room with benches along the walls and a raised desk at the front, where the county recorder, a thin, precise man named Harold Fitch, sat with his files and his wire-rimmed glasses, and the particular air of a man who had seen every variety of land dispute and was not going to be surprised by this one. Callum was already there when they arrived. So were Hank Briggs and Tom Meyer and Pete Garfield, who had come without being asked a second time. Clara Birch was sitting on the far bench with her husband, the Reverend, who nodded at Clem when he came in. Warren Pratt was there, broad and tight-jawed, with Dillard beside him. Dillard had his leather satchel. He looked like a man who had spent the night making calculations. Martha sat in the second row. Clem sat beside her. Their arms were almost touching. Fitch called the hearing to order at 9 o'clock precisely. He was efficient. He read the Pratt filing the Hadley counter-objection, the denied Creek provisional, and Callum's disclosure motion into the record. He reviewed the deed. He reviewed Martha's documentation, all 6 pages of it, plus the additional materials she'd added in the days since. and he read it with the careful attention of a man who respected precision. When he was done reading, he looked up. "Mr. Dillard," he said. The disclosure motion filed by Judge Callum asks whether you have knowledge of any communication in which the original claimant Herschel Pratt indicated an intention to abandon or modify the 1871 filing. How do you respond? The room went very still. Dillard sat with his satchel on his knees and his hands folded on top of it. He was a careful man. He was calculating something. Clem's hand resting on his knee closed into a fist. Martha did not move. Dillard said, "The claimant's estate is represented by Warren Pratt as executor. Any communications between the original claimant and family members regarding personal intentions toward the filing would constitute estate matters that—" "Mr. Dillard," Fitch said. He said it without raising his voice, which was somehow more effective. "I asked you a direct question. Did you have knowledge of any such communication, yes or no?" Another silence. Shorter this time. Dillard said, "I was made aware that the original claimant had on one occasion expressed informally to a family member a reservation about the filing." Warren Pratt's head turned sharply toward his lawyer. "A reservation," Fitch said. "A verbal statement. Informal. Not documented." Describing what nature of reservation? Dillard's jaw tightened. Describing a possible intention not to pursue the claim. Fitch looked at him over his glasses for a moment. Then he looked at Warren Pratt. "Mr. Pratt," he said, "you are the estate executor. Were you aware of this communication?" Warren Pratt sat very still. He was a man who had ridden into this room this morning, believing he held all the cards. He was only now understanding that someone had looked at his hand. "My father said a great many things," Warren said. "That is not an answer to my question," Fitch said. Warren looked at Dillard. Dillard looked at his satchel. "Yes," Warren said finally. "I was aware of it." The room exhaled. Fitch made a note. He made it slowly and carefully, which was worse than if he'd made it quickly. "Mr. Callum," he said, "you may proceed." Callum was good. Martha had known he would be, but watching him work was something else. He laid the case out in plain consecutive order. No flourishes, no dramatics, just fact after fact after fact, each one connected to the next like links in a chain. The deed, the stake, the directional error, the 11 years. Hank Briggs stood up and spoke for 4 minutes about specific seasons and specific pasture sections, and he did it with the certainty of a man describing something he had watched with his own eyes. Tom Meyer spoke for 3 minutes. Pete Garfield opened his ledger on the recorder's desk and pointed to entries going back to 1872 without being asked. And then Callum said, "Mr. Hadley." Clem stood up. He stood up the way he did everything without hurry, without performance. He was a big man, and he looked like what he was, a man who had worked 600 acres for 11 years with his own hands. He talked about the land. He talked about it the way Martha had told him to in plain language, without hesitation, saying true things. He described the east pasture in terms of seasons and weather and cattle and grass, not in terms of legal boundaries, and somehow that was more powerful than any filing. He talked about the stake and about Herschel Pratt standing beside it in 1874, saying, "Good solid post Hadley, that'll stand 100 years," and when he said it, you could see it. 2 men in summer heat, standing at a cedar stake, and one of them pointing at it with the certainty of a man who knew whose ground he was standing on. When he was done, the room was quiet in a way that had weight. Warren Pratt was looking at the floor. Dillard was looking at nothing in particular. Fitch made another note. Then he said, "I'm going to take a brief recess before issuing a finding." The recess lasted 11 minutes. Martha counted them. She sat on the bench with her hands in her lap, and Clem sat beside her, and they didn't speak. Hank Briggs leaned over from behind them and said low, "That was good, Clem." And Clem nodded once. Clara Birch caught Martha's eye from across the room and gave her a look that was not quite a smile, but was close the look of a woman who had chosen a side and was glad of her choice. Warren Pratt sat on the opposite bench with his elbows on his knees and his head slightly down. He looked like a man who had come into a room expecting a different room. Dillard was at the far end of the bench, his satchel beside him closed. Fitch came back in and sat down and put his glasses on and looked at his notes. The Pratt filing of 1871, he said, contains a directional error in the boundary description that renders the acreage calculation invalid as written. The error is not ambiguous. It describes territory on the Pratt side of the survey stake, not the Hadley side, and therefore does not support the claim being made. He paused. Additionally, the record now reflects that the claimant's executor had knowledge of a communication in which the original filer expressed an intention to abandon the claim, and that this knowledge was not disclosed prior to the filing of the formal claim this year. He looked up. The Pratt claim on the Hadley East pasture is dismissed, he said. The boundary stands as described in the original Hadley deed. The survey stake is confirmed as the legal eastern boundary marker. He looked at Dillard. The matter of the non-disclosure will be referred to the Territorial Bar Association for review. That is a separate proceeding, and I will not speak further to it today. He closed his file. This hearing is concluded. What happened next was not dramatic. That was the thing Martha would remember. There was no explosion of sound, no moment of wild relief. Hank Briggs put his hand briefly on Clem's shoulder and said, "Good." And Tom Meyer shook his hand, and Pete Garfield closed his ledger and said, "I've got that feed order to fill, so let me know what you need for August." As if nothing of particular significance had occurred, which was the highest compliment a Kansas man could offer. Warren Pratt left without speaking to anyone. Dillard left immediately behind him, and the set of his shoulders said that certain calculations had turned out badly. Callum found Martha near the door. "That documentation," he said. "The 6 pages. Fitch told me after he read it that it was the clearest boundary analysis he'd seen submitted by a non-lawyer in 20 years of county hearings." Martha said, "Tell him I read his county filing guidelines." Callum looked at her. "Did you?" "Webb left a copy when he came to tell us about the denied provisional. I read it the same night." She paused. "The guidelines specify what a boundary analysis needs to contain. I contained it." Callum shook his head slowly, the way a man does when he has run out of ways to be surprised by something. "Edna Foss," he said, not for the first time. "I'll pass on your regards," Martha said. They rode home in the afternoon heat side by side, the same road they'd ridden into town on that morning, and for a while neither of them said anything at all. The land moved past them on both sides, grass and sky, and the particular quality of Kansas light in August, which is flat and golden and uncompromising. The east pasture came into view as they turned off the main road, and Clem pulled his horse up for a moment and looked at it. Just looked at it. Martha pulled up beside him and waited. 11 years, he said. "Yes," she said. He was quiet another moment. Then he said, "My father always said that land doesn't care who claims it. It only knows who works it." Martha looked at the pasture. The cattle were already drifting back toward it from the draw they'd opened the gate that morning before leaving, trusting the outcome, and the herd had made their own way back to the grass they knew. "He was right," she said. Clem turned and looked at her. She felt it before she saw it, the shift in his attention, the particular quality of his looking that she had learned to recognize over 7 weeks and had been careful not to name. "Martha," he said. She turned and met his eyes. "I have something to say," he said. "And I'm going to say it plainly because that's the only way I know how." She waited. I wrote that letter in February because I needed someone practical," he said. "Someone who could manage the house and work the land and not require things I didn't know how to give. That's what I thought I was asking for." "I know," she said. "I wasn't asking for someone who would save my land and face down lawyers on my porch and sit up until midnight writing 6 pages of legal documentation and ride out alone to move 30 head of cattle in July heat." He paused. "I wasn't asking for someone who talks to frightened heifers in the dark and names calves and reads county filing guidelines and tells me the truth even when the truth is hard. Martha was very still. "I wasn't asking for any of that," he said. "But that's what you are. And He stopped, said the next part carefully, like a man who has been thinking about the exact words for some time. "I don't want a practical arrangement anymore. I want what we actually have, which is something I don't have a name for yet. But I know it's more than I bargained for, and I know it's the best thing on this place, and I know I don't want to go back to what it was before you came off that train." The pasture grass moved in the afternoon wind. One of the cattle lowed somewhere in the distance, long and low. Martha looked at him. This quiet, stubborn, careful man who had written the most unromantic letter in the history of matrimonial arrangements and had turned out to be more than his letter, said the same way she was, more than what she looked like. "Clem," she said, "are you asking me something?" "I'm asking you to stay," he said. "Not because the arrangement says so, because I'm asking." He held her gaze. "Will you stay?" She had been ready for many things in her life. She had been ready for hard work and cold winters and the kind of loneliness that a capable woman carries when the world keeps telling her that capability is all she has to offer. She had been ready for that. She had not been ready for this man on this road asking her to stay, like the answer mattered more to him than the east pasture or the water rights or any of it. "Yes," she said, "I'll stay." He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand, her broad, work-roughened, capable hand, and held it for a moment. Just that. Just her hand in his on a Kansas road in August, with the east pasture full of cattle that had come home on their own, and the cottonwood stand marking the boundary where a cedar stake had stood for 11 years and would stand for 100 more. Then he let go, and they rode home. 3 months later, on a Thursday in November, Clem Hadley and Martha Dawson were married in the Abilene Methodist Church by Reverend Birch, with Clara Birch weeping in the front row, and Hank Briggs standing up as witness, and Pete Garfield in the back with his ledger books under his arm, because he'd come straight from the store and hadn't thought to leave them. Edna Foss sent a letter from Wichita that arrived the following week. It said, "I told you to trust me on this one." Clem read it and handed it to Martha without comment. Martha read it and set it on the shelf above the door next to the household tin. That evening she cooked supper, and he set the table. He had been setting the table since August. It had become his task without discussion. And they ate in the quiet that was their quiet, the one they had built together, that was nothing like the empty silence of before. After supper, he looked across the table at her. "Mrs. Hadley," he said. She looked up. He said it like he was still getting used to the sound of it, like it was something he intended to keep saying for a long time. She picked up her coffee cup and looked at him over the rim of it with the expression that had started as an almost smile back in July, and had over the months become simply a smile, real and unhurried and entirely her own. "Mr. Hadley," she said, "outside on 640 acres of Kansas plain, because the county recorder had corrected the deed to reflect the full eastern boundary, all 40 acres confirmed and documented, the land settled into its November quiet. The cattle were in the winter pasture. The garden was put to bed. The survey stake stood at the edge of the cottonwood stand, iron hard and unmoved exactly where it had always been. He had written a letter asking for plain. He had gotten the better bargain by a country mile, and both of them knew it.